It's on I-24 News.
Hello and welcome. You're watching Middle East Now on I-24 News. First, the headlines. The head of Israel's domestic intelligence agency, the Shin Bet, on his way to Cairo for the latest round of hostage talks. The widow of the late ISIS leader al-Baghdadi sentenced to death in Iraq for her part in the genocide of the Yazidi people. And a crackdown on terrorism in the United Arab Emirates, with 43 members of the Muslim Brotherhood jailed. First, the head of Israel's Shin Bet intelligence agency is on his way to Cairo for the latest attempt at a hostage release deal. The Washington Post has been citing an unnamed senior American official as claiming that Hamas has signaled for the first time it's willing to accept a power other than itself ruling Gaza. Hamas, though, says it has heard no further updates and is accusing Israel of playing for time in order to scupper the deal. More in this report.
This could be the biggest breakthrough in the effort to reach a ceasefire in Gaza. Mediators have been shuttling this week between Cairo, Doha, and Jerusalem after Hamas issued an offer, reportedly dropping some of its key demands. Top Israeli intelligence officials also visited Qatar, signaling Israel's interest in brokering an agreement, or at least not showing any signs of rejecting the deal on the table. The U.S. administration believes it looks promising.
We're cautiously optimistic that things are moving in a good direction, but we also don't want to underestimate the challenges. There are still gaps remaining between the two sides. We believe those gaps can be narrowed.
In a significant step forward, Israel and Hamas have reportedly agreed on an interim governance plan for Gaza. The Washington Post cites a U.S. official familiar with the talks, saying that during the second phase of the ceasefire, Gaza will be governed by 2,500 Palestinian Authority supporters already identified and approved by Israel. The source says Hamas is ready to give up control of the Strip within the agreed framework. However, Israeli officials have reported that the gaps are still wide and that negotiations will be difficult, after Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu set out a list of non-negotiable demands for a ceasefire. Meanwhile, the fate of 120 hostages still held by terror groups in Gaza is at stake as the Israeli team returns to Qatar to attempt to negotiate their release. Israel's defense minister has indicated that time is running out.
The determined actions of the security system have created the conditions for the return of the hostages. A limited window of opportunity will open before us to fulfill our moral and ethical duty to bring them home.
Several Israeli sources say the potential deal largely depends on Netanyahu's willingness to jeopardize his premiership, as his right-wing partners have threatened to leave the coalition if a deal is approved before Hamas is completely destroyed. But the head of Israel's largest opposition party, Yair Lapid, stated earlier this week that he would support the deal in parliament in order for it to pass, all as the nation longs for the return of the hostages and an end to the war that has dragged on for over 9 months.
Well, here to talk about all of that, I'm joined in the studio by Ruth Wasserman-Lander, former member of the Knesset and now research fellow at the Misgav Institute for National Security. She's also the former co-chair of the Abraham Accords Parliamentary Caucus. Good to see you as always, Ruth.
Lovely to see you too.
So if this report in the Washington Post is true, it is an opinion piece, but it does cite an unnamed American official. Hamas would be accepting for the first time a power other than itself in Gaza. What do you make of it?
Absolutely nothing. One, because Hamas always lies. But say, let's take it as face value and pretend that they never lie and that they are willing to take and accept a different manager for the Palestinian population within the Gaza Strip. It would be a front for their own rule. This is not a kind of a leadership that would allow anybody else to rule. In fact, they murder with their own bare hands their own people that steal food that is given free without charge by the United Nations and other bodies in the international arena. These are the people that have shot the Fatah Palestinian leaders in 2006, shot them in the kneecaps and threw them out of the windows. These people ran to Israeli soldiers, the so-called enemy, to be saved from the Hamas. So this is a very smart move, by the way, by the Hamas, trying to say that they are the so-called proponents of a different kind of a plan, a different rule, etc., etc. But this is absolutely meaningless, without any doubt, attempting to perhaps await for an answer from Israel, but this is a meaningless step.
It seems like something the Americans would very much like to push forward. You know, they're talking about a force of 2,500 troops from unnamed Arab countries who would be trained by the United States to take over in Gaza. I mean, does it seem realistic to you?
For me, looking at, for example, UNIFIL, okay, in the north of the country, whose sole purpose was to make sure that the Hezbollah doesn't come 1 millimeter away from the Israeli border and look into the living rooms of Israeli civilians living just by the border within Israel itself. And they have absolutely failed in doing so. In fact, they have absolutely no ability to make sure that Hezbollah does anything. On the contrary, if anything, they're afraid of the Hezbollah and they are not maintaining any kind of law enforcement. Why would it be different in the Gaza Strip?
There are a lot of concerns here in Israel about Israel potentially having to give up control of the Rafah crossing and the Philadelphia corridor.
Precisely.
Because that is what has cut off the weapons smuggling to Hamas, and that is what's preventing them from rearming. Would that be a big mistake in your view for Israel to agree to that?
I think that if there is not some kind of a solution, which I must admit, at the moment, I cannot creatively think of one. That doesn't mean it doesn't exist. This opening is, in fact, the lifeline for the Hamas in terms of weapons. They're not going to give this up. They're not going to, it's not going to be like turkeys walking to their death sentence. It's not going to work. This is something that needs to be enforced in the maximum manner in order to prevent. So this is the opening. But apart from that, I don't see the Hamas, in fact, sharing their power or sharing their leadership with anybody else. It absolutely, whoever knows the Hamas, knows the mentality, understands the language, you don't have to go far. You just need to listen to what they say, not in English.
Ruth, for now, thank you very much. Well, as Israel fights on multiple fronts, its most important ally is increasingly embroiled in domestic politics. More and more Democrats are casting doubt on President Biden's fitness to seek re-election in November. They include the Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer. More in this report.
This is the most anticipated election in the world, with its outcome expected to impact major international issues such as the wars in Israel and Ukraine. However, incumbent President Joe Biden is pressed to drop out of the race as he faces mounting doubts about his re-election chances from within his own party. Calls for Biden to step aside intensified following his weak performance in a debate with his long-standing Republican rival. Donald Trump.
Meanwhile, the radical left Democrat Party is divided in chaos and having a full-scale breakdown, all because they can't decide which of their candidates is more unfit to be president.
Among the most prominent Democrats hinting that Biden should quit the race is former House Speaker Nancy Pelosi.
It's up to the president to decide if he is going to run. We're all encouraging him to make that decision because time is running short.
Pelosi, a longtime Biden ally, is one of the few voices who can directly influence Biden's decision on the matter. Another highly influential voice is Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer, who has privately signaled he is open to replacing Joe Biden as the Democratic candidate, according to a report by Axios. In response, Schumer did not confirm or deny the report, but reiterated his support for Biden. Meanwhile, Hollywood star George Clooney, who co-hosted a fundraiser for Biden last month, withdrew his support with a damning opinion piece in the New York Times, saying Biden was not the same man he was in 2020. At least 10 Democratic members of Congress have openly called on Biden to quit the race.
You know, the fighting spirit and pride and courage that served the country so well 4 years ago, helped Joe Biden win, will bring the ticket down this time. He just has to step down.
While many still support Biden's nomination, others see Vice President Kamala Harris as a potential replacement if the president does step aside. Meanwhile, Biden's campaign reiterates he is firmly committed to staying in the race and beating Trump.
Well, for more on that, let's go to New York. We're joined by our senior US correspondent, Mike Wagenheim. Mike, so right up until a couple of days ago, there was this solid wall of support for Joe Biden, wasn't there? We are really seeing some cracks begin to appear, though, aren't we?
No doubt whatsoever. Not quite that the dam has broken yet, but yes, definitely cracks right now, chinks in the armor, so to speak, for Joe Biden. And I think we're really going to be able to tell once all these NATO leaders leave town over the next, 24, 48 hours, I think we're going to start to really see how deep those cracks really run here. I think there are a lot of members of Congress right now who are holding off voicing their opinions because they don't want to embarrass Biden on the world stage with all these foreign leaders in town. They don't want to call into question his leadership, his capability. You're supposed to not bring up issues while your leader is on foreign soil. Well, it's kind of the opposite right now. They're not bringing up these issues while other foreign leaders are on American soil for the exact same reason. They want to try to protect the leader of the party with all the world watching. Once that disappears, I think we're going to start to see some more Congress members come out here and really voice their opinions. And by the way, a key member right now of Congress, the minority leader in the U.S. House of Representatives, Hakeem Jeffries, who's been behind Biden as much as you can be to this point, said he's now going to go to every member of the Democratic caucus, allow them to have their voices heard, essentially behind closed doors, and then Jeffries will come out and really lay it out exactly where the House stands right now on the Democratic side in terms of Biden. I think that's a key factor right now in hearing out the House and making sure their voices are heard, not singularly, but as a whole. And we're hearing the same thing from Nancy Pelosi, too, right now. Pelosi said, we need Joe Biden to make a decision. Well, Biden comes out and says, I'm here. I'm the guy. I'm not bowing out. I'm not backing down. And Pelosi comes right back and says, we need to have Biden make a decision. It's these little hints that are being sent out right now, not in full-throated, nature, but little hints that are being sent to Biden saying, hey, you've got to step back here before essentially you're forced in some way to step back.
Yeah, the hints are getting more and more obvious, aren't they, Mike? Well, what does this mean then for American foreign policy at what is, of course, a very critical and dangerous time, especially right here in the Middle East?
And that's exactly why I think a lot of Congress members and others within the Democratic Party are holding off, because there's so much at stake right now in terms of foreign policy with this NATO conference. But when you talk about the Middle East, especially so, remember, the Middle East, probably more than any other region in the world, when leaders sense weakness, that's when they strike. Sometimes it's a little test. Sometimes it's more serious than that. But when they sense any sort of weakness, that's when they go after you. If they sense weakness from the White House, from the American presidency, regardless of who's in there, and they're looking for an opportune time to strike, well, that's their opening right there. So anytime, regardless of your political preferences, affiliations, what have you, anytime there is a weakness in the White House and you're an ally of Israel, you're a supporter of Israel, that is a time to have concern that there may be something coming from your enemies within the Middle East. It is not a good time right now for watchers of the Middle East in terms of what comes next, knowing that there is so much uncertainty right now emanating from Washington.
Mike, thank you very much. Mike Wagenheim there over in New York. Well, the US political timetable means there are only a few weeks left before Congress goes on recess, and with the focus increasingly on the election, one of the casualties is likely to be that much vaunted Saudi normalization deal. Well, to talk more about that, we're joined by Asher Fredman, Director for Israel and the Abraham Accords Peace Institute, and a Senior Fellow at the Misgav Institute for National Security. Thank you very much for being with us, Asher. Good to see you again. And Secretary of State Anthony Blinken, he has been back and forth a few times. He's been here in Israel. He's also been in Saudi Arabia. He's met with the Crown Prince and other senior officials there. However hard they try, it seems like it is just not going to happen under this president.
There are meetings that are happening. It was obviously would be a major foreign policy win for President Biden right before the elections. But I think you're right. And I think it's in Israel's interest and even in America's interest to wait until after the elections, whether the next president is President Trump or President Biden. The Israel and the United States' negotiating position vis-a-vis Saudi Arabia would be better in any case.
But rather than normalizing with Israel, there are signs that the Saudis are going in the opposite direction. They're moving closer to China. They're moving closer to Iran. We saw the first flight in 12 years from Syria land in Riyadh yesterday as the Saudis seem to be embracing President Assad. That might be difficult to undo, whatever the changes in the US.
The Saudis indeed sense American weakness or American non-involvement in the region. The Chinese, the Russians, and even the Iranians are working very hard to court them, to create economic ties with them. We have to remember the fundamental suspicion and hostility between the Saudis and the Iranians still very much exists. I do believe that an American administration fully committed to expanding the Abraham Accords and deepening regional cooperation could in fact succeed, and succeed in fact fairly quickly in putting the ties back on the positive track, the positive momentum, but it will take an American administration fully committed to this goal.
All right, Asher, stay with us. Let me bring in Ruth Wasserman-Land, who's with me in the studio. And Ruth, because you've worked on the Abraham Accords, as I mentioned, yourself, just explain to us, how do you think what is happening here is being seen in Riyadh? Because they want a strong Israel for a partner. They're not interested in a weak Israel. How do you think that they are seeing the way the war is going over there?
So one of the most important key factors that the Saudis wish from Israel in order to move forward on anything, and I do believe that they are extremely keen to move forward. They are maneuvering and pushing forward a policy with a very smart, strategic manner of looking at things, understanding that they need to make peace or relative peace with all of their enemies, including Iran, rapprochement, including Qatar, including Syria, and so on and so forth, but also with Israel. But they need a strong Israel. They need a stable Israel. They need to see that Israel is with its hand. It has its upper hand in what is happening with the Palestinians. That's number one. Number two, I absolutely agree with my colleague from the Misgav Institute for National Security, with Asher Fredman, saying that basically they are waiting to see who will hold the realm and who will hold the reins in the United States of America. Will there be a different administration, and then they can get perhaps maybe more stability, maybe more commitment in that specific issue of Abraham Accords oriented kind of cooperation? And we are just in the opening, a couple of months away from the elections. They are waiting to be a little bit more sure.
Asher, do you agree with that?
I do agree with that. I do think that the basic logic of Israel-Saudi cooperation for trade, for stability, for regional defense, for regional integration still exists. The Saudis also have to contend with very negative public opinion in the Arab world. But because the underlying logic, the underlying mutual benefits still exist, and I think that my colleague Ruth is absolutely correct. The Saudis want to see Israel strong. The Saudis don't understand why it's taking Israel so long to defeat Hamas in Gaza. The Saudis don't understand why Israel's reaction to Iran's 300 missiles and
actually, do they not? I mean, if we compare the way the war in Gaza has gone compared to the way the Saudi-led coalition tried and failed to defeat the Houthis in Yemen, I mean, surely they can see that Israel is doing better than they did on that front.
Israel's doing better, but nevertheless, the small territory that we control all of its borders. I think the Saudis would have liked and would like this war to end with Hamas defeated, but they would like it to end as quickly as possible. Unfortunately, due to American pressure, it's one of the main reasons why this war has been going more slowly. But again, once you have an American administration that's fully committed to regional cooperation, I remain optimistic about the potential. And personally, I would advise both Israeli and American decision makers to wait until after the elections, whatever the outcome.
On a brighter note, Asha, there are signs that the pace of modernization inside Saudi Arabia is happening at a breakneck pace. We've just seen an advert for an American footwear brand that shows, unveiled young women participating in sports. This has really made a big splash online. We can't show you the images, sadly. You'll have to go and find them yourselves. But are you hopeful that a more open Saudi society is going to be what drives stability in this part of the world, turning away, and in a quite short period of time, turning away from jihadism, from radicalism, and embracing, modernism, business, and the future?
Absolutely. What Saudi Arabia and what its leadership have been able to accomplish in a few short years is remarkable, both in terms of modernization, opening up the country to tourism, opening up the country to cultural events. And in a post-Hamas Gaza, if and when Hamas is defeated, both the Saudis and the Emiratis have led very impressive processes of de-radicalization within their own countries. And I believe that they could play a very important role in a similar de-radicalization process in Gaza as well, though again, that will require Hamas to be defeated so that a new leadership can take over.
All right, Asher Friedman, great to talk to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Great to talk. Great to be here.
Well, let's turn our attentions to the north now, because a man was critically wounded earlier today in the north of Israel after a multiple drone attack from Hezbollah in Lebanon. We can get the latest with our correspondent Zach Anders, who's up in the north of the country for us now. Zach, any updates on that person who was wounded earlier?
Yeah, we don't have a status update. The last we know is critically wounded in this drone attack that took place near Kibbutz Kabri. This is a 30-year-old man, by our understanding. He was taken to Ziv Medical Center in the Galilee. No update at this point, and that is kind of usually where things sit, especially considering some of these attacks, if they involve. We don't know if this is a civilian casualty or a IDF soldier at this point either. So usually there's about a 24-hour window before we learn any of details. Of course, the family is the first to be informed.
And of course, we had this drone attack, didn't we, Zach? Amid reports that the United States is trying to secure a deal with Hamas that would also push back Hezbollah. Do you have any idea of how that is being read, interpreted inside Lebanon today?
Yeah, it's been met with some trepidation as we're watching some of the Lebanese media channels. One of the leaders of one of the minority parties, the Lebanese Forces Party, is about 19 seats in parliament, one of the Christian parties, saying, on the backs of this, we're going to have to strengthen, or actually really questioning why aren't Lebanese forces provided with the funds, the equipment to move underneath the Litani, the south of the Litani, and secure this area. But at the the same time also noting that Hezbollah is a strong political force. And this is going to be the reality no matter what happens, that even if a deal is agreed, that this territory, and really we're talking about land when it all comes down to it, that Hezbollah is in control of the south. Any reality, any political reality is going to need to reflect that. And we're seeing that inside of Lebanon's political circles today. A lot of comments supporting, encouraging, but realizing that Hezbollah is going to remain south of the Litani, at least as a dominant political force.
All right, Zach, thank you very much indeed. Zach Andrews there up in the north of Israel. Ruth Wasserman is with me in the studio. And Ruth, we heard from the Hezbollah chief himself yesterday, Hassan Nasrallah, saying that he would like a ceasefire, but that depends on what Hamas agrees to.
I would like to put in context the general outlook of the Hezbollah and Hamas. First of all, the overarching mastermind behind this is Iran. And I remind everybody that the plan is not just Gaza, it's not just the West Bank, it's not just Lebanon and Syria. In fact, these are parts of a puzzle. The puzzle basically does not forward anything to do with Palestinian interests, whether it's freedom fighting, whether it's the piece of land specifically in Gaza or the West Bank or the country or whatever. The actual objective, the goal, is to create a caliphate, first in the region, but also in Europe and in the United States of America. This has been proven. There are actual statements by American intelligence set out very recently in the last couple of days saying that there are connections of Iran funding the demonstrations throughout the Western world, certainly in the United States of America, but there are also cells, Hezbollah cells, Shiite cells, some dormant, some more active in Europe, Western Europe, Canada, and so on and so forth. This is the master plan. So when Hezbollah says something which is tactical, like we will stop if the war in Gaza stops, that's all fine, but it's very temporary. Will the inhabitants who had left their homes, had been in fact displaced, and there are tens of thousands of those in Israel, approximately 60 to 80,000 of those that have left their homes and do not feel safe because Hezbollah is literally on the border. There is nothing that UNIFIL is doing to prevent that. Nobody is preventing it, and they in fact discounting anything that the United Nations had decided.
Are you worried that we might be on the verge of another deal that doesn't really solve any problems? It just kicks it down the road, as we have seen with
any deal with either Hezbollah or Hamas is temporary, first of all. That's why I explained the grander plan, because it's temporary for a tactical purpose. Will the inhabitants of Israel, the citizens of Israel from the north come back if the Hezbollah does not move away from the border? Of course not. They'd be afraid that the same thing would happen like on October 7th. And it probably would, because this is the grand plan. It's just a matter of timing. So the agreements are a tactical and small part of the puzzle. We need to understand the bigger picture and act accordingly.
All right, Ruth, thank you for now. We're going to take a very short break. Do stay with us. When we come back, the UN Special Envoy to Yemen is trying to secure a major prisoner exchange with the Houthis. We'll get the detail on that next. Stay with us.
My asthma used to be very bad, and then before the Z medic machine, I had to use the nebulizer a lot, and I wasn't able to run as much. I wasn't able to swim and go in the water for as long.
We've been struggling since he's a newborn with asthma, with the nebulizer and the steroids, the Prelone, the prednisone. There's sometimes hospitalization. Z medic machine is very highly recommended. If this could keep us off steroids, it's an unbelievable machine, this Z medic machine.
This broadcast is brought to you by Israel Bonds, the most direct and impactful way to support Israel. Invest now at israelbonds.com. This broadcast is brought to you by Israel Bonds, the most direct and impactful way to support Israel. Invest now at israelbonds.com.
Welcome back. Now, after a week-long pause, Yemen's Houthis appear to have resumed their attacks on shipping. A Liberian-flagged vessel came under attack today in the Bab el-Mandeb Strait. The Houthis are hinting, meanwhile, that they may release a political leader with close ties to the country's internationally recognised government. Mohammed Katan is slated to be part of a UN-brokered prisoner swap. The UN is also calling for the release of dozens of its own workers, aid workers, who were detained by the Houthis last month. To talk more about the situation in Yemen, we're joined by Luay Ahmed. He's a columnist at Bulletin and a presenter on Builders of the Middle East. Great to have you with us, Luay. Thank you for joining us. So
Thank you for having me.
Good to see you. Let's start with this proposed UN prisoner swap then. The Houthis are kind of hinting that they may release this man, Mohammed Katan. Is this a sign that they are perhaps softening their stance and are willing to compromise?
Sadly, no. This is a part of a roadmap to peace that has been going on long before October 7th. So in the beginning of 2023, the Houthis and the Saudi Arabia and the Saudi government have decided to actually have a ceasefire and a truce. And they opened up the Sana'a airport for the first time in a very long time. And it was the first time in 10 years where Yemen had somewhat of peace. So this is just resuming a long process of trying to swap the detainees between the two places. And Mohammed Katan has been a big deal because he is one of the major leaders in the Islahi political party. So sadly, this has nothing to do with the current situation, but rather it is a part of a process that has been happening even before October 7th. So sadly, this does not show any slowing down of the Houthis' rage and anger.
Meanwhile, there is a great deal of concern, isn't there, Luay, about the fate of these aid workers, charity workers, including women who were attacked and detained by the Houthis a few weeks ago. Let's take a quick listen to this official from Human Rights Watch talking about that.
Since May 31st, the Houthis, who are the de facto authorities in much of Yemen, have been arresting dozens of people across Yemen, including many staff at UN agencies, international NGOs, and also Yemeni civil society organizations. Houthi forces also did not tell families where they were taking their family members, and to this day, none of those who've been detained have had any contact with their families or with a lawyer. The arrests amount to enforced disappearance and arbitrary detention. The arrests come at a time when the majority of people in Yemen do not have access to adequate food and water and other basic necessities.
And Luay, there is a great deal of concern about what is happening to those people. Do you have any news on their situation?
Right. So when it comes to the Islahi and Houthi detainees, usually they're actually treated well. Around 200 detainees that the Houthis released 2 months ago were properly treated. They ate well. There was no rape or any bad conduct. And that is because the Houthis and the Islahis, Yemenis in general, have a tribal code where you do not treat the detainees badly because you do not want your own detainees to also be treated badly. So there is this very beautiful conduct of you do not treat detainees horribly. But the sad part is that the UN workers and the aid workers are affiliated to the United Nations and the US and the Zionist agenda, which the Houthis hate so much. They have it in their logo. And that allows for this misconduct and bad treatment of the detainees, sadly. And the thing is that in Yemen, the human rights organizations and the civil society organizations that track all of these bad conduct and horrible treatments of detainees and prisoners and just any human rights violations, they are not legitimate and they are not properly functional because of the Houthis and because of the dysfunctional state of the country right now. So we hope and pray for the detainees and everybody to be alive and well and not to be treated badly, but there are no any reports about them. And usually in Yemen, we say when there are no reports, when we hear nothing about something, then it does not mean it's something good.
And of course, those aid workers are very much needed in Yemen, aren't they? I mean, it's not been covered so much, but Yemen was the world's poorest country, Arab world's poorest country, even before this war that killed up to 250,000 people. There was a famine there. There is very much a need for aid inside this country.
Exactly. Regardless of the lack of concern or care from the international community and the protests, we don't see any protests about Yemen and the famine going on there, for example. Yemen is actually, according to the United Nations, the world's biggest humanitarian crisis. More than 10 million Yemeni children, 10 million Yemeni children are impoverished and they have nothing to eat. Children in Yemen are boiling grass and greens just to be able to eat anything. So it's a very dire situation. And the war between the Houthis and Saudi Arabia has not been helping. There are more people starving, more people who are in need of humanitarian aid. So the fact that the aid workers are being imprisoned and treated badly is just not a good sign, because what Yemen needs right now is we need to pave the road towards peace. And that starts with stopping the terrorism. And it's sad now to see that the Houthis are actually gaining popularity in Yemen because of their war against Israel. And that is nothing that peaceful Yemenis and the people who want the best of Yemen and Yemenis, it's just we want our Yemeni children to eat. We want our schools to function. We don't want rockets or war with Israel or anyone else for that matter.
Luai Ahmed, thank you very much. Great to talk to you.
Thank you for having me.
Ruth Wasserman-Landa is with me in the studio. It is another front in the war on Israel, as you were talking about earlier, the Iranian-backed multi-front war on Israel. But interestingly, Saudi Arabia, which has been increasingly directly attacked by the Houthis lately, has asked China for protection. That should be a source of concern, shouldn't it, for the region?
I think that China is coming in where there is a vacuum. Given the relative weakness of the Americans, at least from the perception of the role players in the Middle East, like Saudi Arabia, for example, like other countries in the region. So countries are turning to different powers for support. We can take Egypt as an example as well. The economic situation in Egypt is extremely dire. The Houthis, by the way, and their attacks on ships in the Suez Canal have also badly affected Egypt in terms of economy, but not only. And the problem is that the United Arab Emirates and the Saudis, who have been funding Egypt for a very long time, have become more insulated and recently, and the Egyptians are at a loss to whom they should turn, which is also a very dangerous situation. Are they going to sell their souls to the likes of Iran or other nations that are always looking for this kind of opening? So just to answer that very quickly, the Iranians are at their best when there is chaos in a country. They've done that in Lebanon, they've done that in Syria, they've done that in Iraq, and they also did this in Yemen. They are trying to do the same thing in Jordan, and they are trying their best to get Israelis at one another's throats, not only via Israeli Arabs, but also Jews versus Jews. This is the way of the modus vivendi, the way of operation
they've
of
kind
Iran.
of replaced the Soviets as the masters
Exactly,
of this,
exactly, pulling the strings away from their own territory, how to create chaos, because they thrive in this instability and chaos.
All right. Ruth Wasserman-Land, we appreciate it. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Now, a court in Iraq has handed down a death sentence for one of the widows of the late ISIS leader Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi. It's almost 10 years since ISIS began its campaign of genocide against the Yazidi minority. The woman, who's been identified as Asma Mohammed, was convicted of complicity in the kidnapping of Yazidi women and girls who were later sold as sex slaves to the ISIS terrorists. Well, joining us now, Intifad Kambar is the president and founder of the Kurdish Protection Action Committee, and he's a former spokesman for the Deputy Prime Minister of Iraq. Good to see you, Intifad. And let's talk about this woman then. She was convicted of keeping Yazidi women in her home and generally contributing to the atrocities that was perpetrated against this very vulnerable minority.
I mean, she was facilitating like a conveyor belt for sex slavery for her husband, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi. And as they call them, sabaya. And the sabaya, honestly, in Arabic, it doesn't only mean sex slave. It means they devastated, the impoverished. So they consider the Yazidis, who are kuffar, mean non-believers, as sex slaves. And she was facilitating sex sessions for her husband in a heinous way. That shows us how ugly is political Islam is, because they can use texts from Islam and from the books of Islam, like the Quran, Hadith, to enslave others and to kill others. And that's how it shows us a common understanding how heinous is political Islam, as we see what Hamas has done as well when they raped Israeli women and hostages and killed babies. So as ISIS in Iraq. Honestly, I don't call it anymore political Islam. I call it as the Islamic Nazism, the new Islamic Nazism, which is spreading in Europe and all over the world, unfortunately, without much attention of the West and the United States.
Yeah, it's truly shocking to hear what that woman is accused of. But does this conviction, do you think, represent a small step towards justice for the survivors of the ISIS attacks a decade ago now?
Well, unfortunately, justice has not been served yet in Iraq. The killers of 1,400 recruits in Spiker who were killed in cold blood, videotaped, has not all of them been captured because of the political mayhem in Iraq, because of the Iranian intervention, because of the political targeting. But would I say this woman deserved the death penalty? Absolutely, she deserves it. And she deserves it well after what she's done to other Yazidi women. I met some of these Yazidi sex slaves, as you want to call them, or sabaya. I've met them in person, and they were telling me horrifying stories. They were like 12 years old, 11 years old, 13 years old, and they were not only having sex with Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, but when he finishes his business with them, his sex business with them, he will sell them out in a market in the middle of Mosul, in a like auction market to others, and they go from hand to hand to 6, 7, 8, 10 people use them as sex slaves. It's really unimaginable something like this happen in our times. And when some people talk about human rights and what Hamas have, for example, have done in October 7th, it's the most heinous thing. And it's unbelievable some people still think Hamas is right or still think ISIS is right of what they're doing.
Well, the ISIS so-called caliphate attracted people from all over the world, didn't it? Some came from Europe, but Iraqi people also suffered. Not just the Yazidis, but Iraqis from across the board suffered under the tyranny of ISIS. So why did the government in Baghdad call on the UN to wrap up its investigation? Why doesn't it want a definitive, process, investigation into what happened?
I mean, there is complicated, for you to mention about the recruiting, all these terror organizations, especially Islamic terror organizations, they target vulnerable people. They target ex-criminals. Many of the ISIS leaders were ex-criminals, drug dealers, gangsters in their own countries, impoverished, unknown, and they seek fame. And believe it or not, there are also women who are in European countries volunteer to be sex slaves for them and go and wear all the kind of Islamic imposed clothes on them to be sex slaves. And they were, many of them are returning to their own countries in Europe and Canada, and the United States refused some of them. In terms of the issue of ISIS in Iraq has been complicated by the sectarianism of Shia versus Sunnis. The Iranians and the Iranian militias considered every Sunni as an ISIS, which is absolutely not true. And I call it the ISISification of the Sunnis in a way of a massive attempt by Iran to change Iraq formation and to abolish the Sunnis, to transfer the Sunnis in Iraq to refugees without a land or land without people. And that's what has happening, and that's why justice has been lost with ISIS and any other terror organization. Not to mention, Iran uses ISIS in many instances to create mayhem and to impose their own will. And that's how they form the militias. They form the militias in an excuse that is in response with ISIS. And that's also, but Iran uses this pretext to accuse others, to accuse Israel, to accuse the United States of forming ISIS. But we know that the United States and Israel is no way have any interest in forming ISIS, and the only beneficiary of ISIS is Iran and their militias.
Entifad, thank you very much indeed. Entifad Kampbar there. Well, meanwhile, the government in Baghdad has been working to repatriate thousands of stolen artifacts after they were smuggled out of the country during the US-led invasion back in 2003. Many of the recently recovered pieces have been put on display at an exhibition in the capital. Our Emma Siegel has the story.
Some historians call it the cradle of civilization. While marred with constant war and instability, Iraq boasts ancient archaeological sites with artifacts dating back thousands of years. But in recent decades, particularly after the 2003 U.S. invasion, many of these artifacts and key pieces of Iraqi history were looted and smuggled out of the country. Now, the Iraqi Foreign Ministry is working to get it all back.
Today, I hand over to my colleague, His Excellency the Minister of Culture, the outcome of the great joint efforts by the Foreign and Culture Ministries and other government agencies, which resulted in the recovery of important Iraqi antiquities which were recovered from abroad.
Most of the ancient pieces on display were returned by the U.S. after the Iraqi Prime Minister visited Washington in April.
It is a great honor on this day to receive a large number of antiquities, including those brought over by the Prime Minister from the United States. And this constitutes the majority of artifacts today, and we will have a special celebration to honor these in the Iraqi Museum.
While 181 smuggled artifacts were given back to Iraq, thousands went missing in the initial looting. UNESCO is now working with the Iraqi authorities to aid in the restoration of Iraq's cultural heritage and recover more pieces. And the Iraqi ministry has emphasized its commitment to tracking down the antiquities scattered across the globe, determined to bring priceless parts of its history back home.
There's been a widespread crackdown on terrorism in the United Arab Emirates. 43 members of the Muslim Brotherhood were sentenced to lengthy jail terms. Authorities there say they were planning to carry out attacks in the kingdom. The UAE has a zero-tolerance approach to any efforts to disrupt society via violence. Let's go to Dubai. We're joined by our correspondent, Bastien Bory. Bastien, what is the story then behind this trial?
These rare occasions actually shed some light on the presence of a political opposition in the United Arab Emirates, whatever it may be. Pretty small and meager opposition, it's true, but still, it is made up of several hundred lawyers, teachers, students, and human rights activists who, during the Arab Spring from 2011 until 2013, expressed opinions that were publicly favorable to the Muslim Brotherhood, which is, as you know, a group or an ideology that's opposed to the ruling families of the Gulf states. The Muslim Brotherhood is very much frowned upon in Saudi Arabia, here in the UAE, as well as in Bahrain. But on the other hand, it has some connections in Qatar, and that's part of the reason why Saudi Arabia had boycotted Qatar so firmly for years. And as a result, 80 or so activists still imprisoned here in the Emirates. Among them, we know that 51 should have been theoretically released by now, their sentences having been served. Problem is that they haven't been released, even though some of them should have been 5 years ago. And today they have been retried, and 43, I think, 43 are now guilty of terror offenses.
And it's interesting, isn't it? Because officials in the UAE have tried to convey to European leaders the dangers of Islamist terrorism. They have a very no-nonsense, zero-tolerance approach to it. And it is one of the safest countries in the world as a result of that, isn't it?
Absolutely, but the accusations are still pretty clear. The court sentenced all these defendants, all being Emirati citizens, by the way, to life imprisonment for creating, establishing, and managing a committee called it was a secret party, let's call it, called the Justice and Dignity Committee, with the purpose of committing terrorist acts in the UAE. Some others received prison terms for cooperating with this, for advocating for it on social media, and for laundering money to fund this organization. Now, the verdict can still be appealed, but the accusations, again, are clear. They allegedly incited violence and unrest in the country, mimicking events that we witnessed in other Arab states during the Arab Spring, including protests and clashes leading to potential deaths, injuries, property destruction, and threatening national security. But that's, of course, that is the Emirati version.
And, of course, the Western NGOs are very unhappy about this.
Not only, we are hearing from some of their relatives first, saying that the authorities are keeping them locked up in order to put them through some sort of ideological reintegration course to make sure they're back on the right track, if you will. NGOs, that's true, like Amnesty International, regularly issue reminders, and this matter is sometimes even made public during hearings at the UN Human Rights Council in Geneva, but nothing really changes. And some NGOs were also hoping to take advantage of COP28, the Dubai climate conference last year, to try to draw the media's attention to this story, but to no avail.
Bastien, thank you very much. Bastien Bory there in Dubai.
Pleasure.
Now, many Israeli medical interns who are currently abroad say they don't intend to return at the end of their studies. A new report examines the attitudes of hundreds of interns and says that many are feeling frustrated about the poor conditions here, and that is outweighing their desire to return and work in Israel. This report from Naama Kadosh.
The Israeli brain drain is nothing new. A study recently published in the journal Research Square looked at the attitudes of 297 medical interns from Israel, who between 2013 to 2024 went to do their internship abroad. It found that nearly 3/4 of them, 70%, are not interested in returning home.
They were all asked the same questions regarding motivation and reasons. What gets them to return? What are the pros and what are the cons? Right now, we can say that 50% of them are considering not returning. At the moment, it's difficult to translate this declaration into action, but I can say that in my environment, in the hospital where I work, and in my echelon, every day we hear about more and more who left and don't return.
There's an alarming medical brain drain for many years. It begins with students who go to study medicine abroad. If we ask why, well, better salaries, better working conditions, shorter shifts. shifts. And if we look specifically at the students who study in Europe, it's also because of the way the country treats them. The country treats them like second-class doctors, and that's why many of them, who are eagerly sought after in Germany, England, or the US, decide to stay and work there.
Last week, the Ministry of Finance announced that it would cut 23 million shekels from the budget of the health system in Israel. Despite the growing demand for medical teams occasioned by the war in Gaza, it seems the pool of manpower is actually decreasing.
What are the advantages of abroad? Firstly, it's easier to get accepted there. There's no doubt at all that the competition is not the same competition, and conditions of acceptance are easier. It's not just the easier acceptance. The studies are more manageable. As someone who studied dentistry in Israel for 2 years, I can compare. The preparation abroad is far stricter, tougher, and better. When I moved from Tel Aviv University to Charles University in Prague, I realized how much more they demand of us. And in the final analysis, what a better doctor I will become. Opening doors to the world is far more complex in Israel.
Aside from the Israeli lifestyle and fast pace, the intern said that a fundamental consideration has to do with professional opportunities and the acquisition of extensive professional knowledge.
The number of doctors that we produce is not necessarily the number of doctors that we will receive, because a lot of them will decide to move abroad as young doctors or as specialists. This is an extremely worrying phenomenon.
I come from a family of doctors. My father was a deputy director of the trauma department at Ichilov Hospital, and my brother is a skin doctor. I can tell you that I see what's going on at home, and I don't think the salary really fits the amount of effort doctors have to invest in Israel. A student has to go through 12 to 15 years of studying until he can begin work as a senior doctor in a department. Firstly, this takes a long time. And secondly, when you finally reach this stage, it's simply not worth it. There are countries where employment conditions are much simpler and easier, and where you work less hours and so you have more time for your family. And the reality of Israel doesn't hit you, which is what is beginning to interest me. And the salaries are much better. So apart from Zionism, which is what pulls you back to Israel, from a professional point of view, I don't see the point.
What happens when the low wages, the long shifts, and the cumbersome bureaucracy and the procedures for admission and specialization in the field exceed the Zionist urge? Well, a whole generation of future doctors who decided that enough is enough.
A problem the Israeli government will have to grapple with at some stage, although it does indeed have a lot on its plate right now. Well, that brings us to the end of tonight's edition of Middle East Now. Thank you very much indeed for watching. We hope you've enjoyed the show. Do stay with us on I24 News. Benita Levin is up next with tonight's rundown. Good night.
Currently, I'm in a very advanced stage of the disease and in need of a lung transplant. I'm basically supposed to be grounded to my bed and to my oxygen, but after a year of using Z-Medicare, I can say for sure that the long list of the symptoms and the side effect is getting shorter, and I'm able to manage a sane lifestyle, and especially to function as a wife and a mother, and that is priceless.
A new voice is about to be heard.
אתם צופים בערוץ החדשות i24 News.
i24 News launches its fourth channel in Hebrew, broadcasting 24 hours a day, 7 days a week.
ותיעדו את הטבח.
i24 News in Hebrew brings its international success for the past 10 years to Israel. Real-time news, sharp analyses, and passionate debates on the burning issues shaping Israeli society and the entire Middle East. And for you, English-speaking viewers, i24 News offers a unique, immersive experience. Every day until 11 a.m. EST, Hebrew programs will be broadcast live with English subtitles. And from 11 a.m. EST, back to your favorite shows in English. More than ever, the heart of a new Middle East beats on i24 News.
On today's program, are negotiators one step closer to a ceasefire hostage deal following talks in Doha? An Israeli team heads to Cairo for the next round of discussions following reports of a breakthrough in which Hamas agrees to give up its power in the Gaza Strip. We bring you the latest updates and speak to an Israeli man whose grandfather is still being held captive by terrorists in Gaza. One person is critically wounded in a Hezbollah drone attack in northern Israel. The strikes coming hours after Hezbollah chief Hassan Nasrallah promises to stop the fighting in Lebanon if a ceasefire is struck between Israel and Hamas. i24 News is live on the ground. And the story of a Gazan journalist holding Israeli civilians hostage in his home is back in the spotlight. 3 U.S. lawmakers have requested that the Justice Department investigate a pro-Palestinian publication with links to that journalist, Abdallah al-Jamal. We speak to one of the lawyers in this unprecedented case. This is The Rundown. I'm Benita Levine. More than 9 months since the darkest day in the history of Israel, reports of some progress in reaching a ceasefire hostage deal. Cautious optimism as the Israeli negotiating team returns from Qatar and Shin Bet head Ronen Bar heads to Egypt for the next round of talks. 279 days since the surprise Hamas terror assault in southern Israel. 120 hostages remain in captivity. They range in age from baby Kfir Bibas to elderly peace activists from the region. It's still not clear how many of the hostages are alive. Meanwhile, the threat from southern Lebanon remains, with Hezbollah chief Hassan Nasrallah reiterating overnight that when the fighting in Gaza stops, then activity out of southern Lebanon will stop. In his words, a ceasefire in the north is tied to a ceasefire in Gaza. Now, the latest reports around a deal indicate a major breakthrough in which Hamas has agreed to give up its power in the Gaza Strip. More in this i24 News report.
This could be the biggest breakthrough in the effort to reach a ceasefire in Gaza. Mediators have been shuttling this week between Cairo, Doha, and Jerusalem after Hamas issued an offer, reportedly dropping some of its key demands. Top Israeli intelligence officials also visited Qatar, signaling Israel's interest in brokering an agreement, or at least not showing any signs of rejecting the deal on the table. The U.S. administration believes it looks promising.
We're cautiously optimistic that things are moving in a good direction, but we also don't want to underestimate the challenges. There are still gaps remaining between the two sides. We believe those gaps can be narrowed.
In a significant step forward, Israel and Hamas have reportedly agreed on an interim governance plan for Gaza. The Washington Post cites a U.S. official familiar with the talks, saying that during the second phase of the ceasefire, Gaza will be governed by 2,500 Palestinian Authority supporters already identified and approved by Israel. The source says Hamas is ready to give up control of the Strip within the agreed framework. However, Israeli officials have reported that the gaps are still wide and that negotiations will be difficult after Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu set out a list of non-negotiable demands for a ceasefire. Meanwhile, the fate of 120 hostages still held by terror groups in Gaza is at stake as the Israeli team returns to Qatar to attempt to negotiate their release. Israel's defense minister has indicated that time is running out.
The determined actions of the security system have created the conditions for the return of the hostages. A limited window of opportunity will open before us to fulfill our moral and ethical duty to bring them home.
Several Israeli sources say the potential deal largely depends on Netanyahu's willingness to jeopardize his premiership, as his right-wing partners have threatened to leave the coalition if a deal is approved before Hamas is completely destroyed. But the head of Israel's largest opposition party, Yair Lapid, stated earlier this week that he would support the deal in parliament in order for it to pass, all as the nation longs for the return of the hostages and an end to the war that has dragged on for over 9 months.
And just a short while ago, Benjamin Netanyahu vowing yet again that Israel will continue the war against Hamas until all its objectives have been achieved. The Prime Minister outlining those goals as he addressed IDF officers at a graduation ceremony. Let's take a listen.
Life, the force of life, will not let us return from the war until we achieve all its objectives. The elimination of the Hamas government in Gaza, the return of all our hostages, the elimination of any future threat from Gaza on Israel, and the return of the residents of the Gaza envelope and the north to their homes. I wish to stress, I am committed to the framework return of our captives. The Hamas murderers continue to insist on demands which contradict the framework, which endanger Israeli security. As Prime Minister, and acting out of a sense of national responsibility, I am not prepared to agree to their demands. So I stand firmly by the 4 principles essential for Israel's security, which are in the framework. 1, Israel can return to fight until it achieves all its war aims, preventing weapons smuggling from Egypt to Hamas, primarily through Israeli control of the Philadelphia corridor and the Rafah crossing. 3, not allowing the return of armed terrorists or weaponry to the north of the Strip. Only this way can we safeguard the achievements won by the blood of our fighters. And 4th, I insist that even in the first stage of the truce, the maximum number of living hostages will return. These are our principles.
So for more insight, it's a pleasure to welcome to studio Lieutenant Colonel in the Reserves, Jonathan Conricus, former international spokesperson in the IDF and senior fellow at the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies, and our Middle East correspondent, Ariel Osaran. Gentlemen, thank you both so much for being here. Jonathan, I want to start with you because we hear conflicting reports around progress around a deal. We know Ronen Bar is on his way tonight with a team to Cairo, and yet one doesn't want to jump the gun because those demands are still sticking points. Red lines remain in place. Your assessment of how close stakeholders are to a deal?
Well, we've been here before. Good evening, Benita. We've been in this situation before, many months ago, when we spoke about there being hope and talks and progress and insinuations and hope for a deal to be made. And those hopes, unfortunately, came up in vain, and our hostages are still in captivity at the cruel hands of Hamas. What worries me very much, except for the fact, of course, that our countrymen are held by terrorists for more than 9 months, is the relative disparity between Prime Minister and Minister of Defense. It seems as if these two elected officials cannot agree on what the step forward is and what the strategy should be. Defense Minister speaks about there being a window of opportunity and our moral obligation to get our people home, while the Prime Minister speaks about the conditions that he believes, and I think they have a lot of merit, to obtain in order to ensure the goals of Israel and the greater strategic security. Doesn't seem as if they are on the same page. That isn't good, because that'll be leveraged by the terrorists. It'll be leveraged by those across the sea who wish to drive a wedge and to weaken the Israeli bargaining position. So all in all, I unfortunately am not optimistic about this round either. I think that Hamas understand very well that they're in a good bargaining position, a strong bargaining position, whereas on the Israeli side, there's mounting pressure and there seems to be a lack of clarity and control and unity as opposed to what Israel really wants to do.
Disheartening to think that there isn't unity, at least within the Israeli team at this juncture, as we wait to hear for word on the fate of the hostages. There's another developing story, Ariel, I want to bring you in on right now, because there was an IDF probe into the rampage on the 7th of October, specifically at Kibbutz Be'eri. It was made public just a short while ago. Colossal errors. Colossal. What is known about the timeline? What unfolded at Kibbutz Be'eri on the 7th of October?
Yeah, I think there's no mistake why Kibbutz Be'eri was the first one to receive, the first kibbutz that was hit, to receive a probe, an investigation, a thorough investigation into what happened on that harrowing day, because it was perhaps seen as a symbol of the kibbutz that was so hardly hit, but also the military failure. We could talk about that. If we're looking at the investigation that was submitted this evening, we're talking about the events in Kibbutz Be'eri, during which 101 local residents and visitors were killed, and 30 more were kidnapped to Gaza. The headline basically is that the IDF, quote, failed in its mission to defend the residents of Be'eri, saying that the IDF was not prepared for a scenario of mass penetration into Israel. Israel may have been prepared for 3 or 4 points of infiltration, but not 30 to 35. That's the number that finally took place on that day. And during those hours, thousands of terrorists entered Israel and rampaged different kibbutzim. Now, specifically regarding Kibbutz Be'eri, the investigation found that between the hours of 9 and 1:30, those are the hours where the kibbutz was entirely under control of Hamas terrorists. Over 300 terrorists. With up against them, you had 23 members of the local security team. That they were also complaining that they didn't have adequate gear in advance. A total of 31 members of security forces died defending the kibbutz, including the 23 emergency response team, who for hours managed to block the wave after wave and also prevent for the terrorists from entering deeper inside Israel. The story of Be'eri, really a story of heroism. If we're talking about a colossal failure of the military, the soldiers really showed bravery. And basically, I think we could take 3 main explanations as to why this massive failure happened. One, in those critical hours, there was no command and control over the forces. There were hundreds of forces amassing outside the kibbutz, but there was no one general to take control and disperse the forces properly. Also, there was no clear picture as to what was going on, because the Southern Command, the communication there was disconnected. Also, there was no strive for contact to attack the terrorists with these hundreds of soldiers amassing outside. And at the end of the day, Kibbutz Be'eri is only an hour and a half away from the Kiryah, from the headquarters of Israel's military establishment. Dozens of high-ranking generals, no one saw to go down there to take leadership and to manage the forces to defend the kibbutz. In this picture that we're seeing now, the red are all areas where the terrorists were in. The red dots are locations where locals were murdered. The yellow spots are where locals were kidnapped, taken into Gaza, and basically for between 6:30 a.m. and 4 p.m. on October 7th, Kibbutz Be'eri was under the control of Hamas terrorists.
Jonathan, your response?
Yeah, so Be'eri is the first after-action review presented and approved by the Chief of Staff, Halevi. It's not the last one. We have additional abysmal failures of the IDF in the Gaza envelope. The story is the story of how IDF defenses failed systemically. And Be'eri is just one sad, horrible example of failure, with additional layers of, according to the report, soldiers and units that didn't do what they were asked to do. They didn't march towards the sound of guns, and they pulled back when they were supposed to go in. One of the special forces that was reported about them. And a general sense of the Gaza division, which was the headquarters that was responsible for the entire area, completely failing in its mission. Be'eri is the first after-action review, 9 months after, which I think as a civilian is a bit of a long time for an after-action review to be presented to the Israeli public, to the survivors of Kibbutz Be'eri. And what we will now see are the similar type of activities with regards to Nir Oz and other communities that were ravaged. And at the end, hopefully, we will have a more systemic understanding, and most importantly, what should be done in the future in order to prevent this in terms of regional defense, static defense. How can the IDF prepare and prevent such a thing from happening, not only in Gaza, but along the Jordanian border, in Judea and Samaria, on the Golan Heights, and vis-a-vis Hezbollah in Lebanon.
Lessons certainly need to be learned. And of course, this report also speaking to the heroic response of the residents of Kibbutz Be'eri. Gentlemen, stay with us because we've got much more to discuss right now. We bring in Daniel Lifshitz, the grandson of Oded Lifshitz, who is still being held hostage by Hamas inside Gaza, day 279 of the war. This is beyond heartbreaking. Daniel, horrific to think waiting for more than 9 months for your family, especially for your grandmother, Yocheved, who was, of course, herself a hostage. She knows all too well the horrors of captivity. Since her release from Gaza, she's been waiting to hear that her husband is coming home. So how is she doing right now?
So, she'd been there for 17 days, awful 17 days. She lost almost 10 kilo in 17 days. She had a very bad diarrhea. We were very lucky to have her back. It took her about 6 months to recover. I speak about the physical recovery, that she gained weight. The mental situation, of course, there is an improvement, but every day she's thinking about my grandfather. After she saw him wounded and unconscious on the backyard of their house in Kibbutz Nir Oz, and she thought he died. And after the first release of the hostages, suddenly we got the information that he's alive and he has been kidnapped. So she's thinking about him and about all the other hostages, and it was heartbreaking for her to hear the news about few hostages. She's been with them inside captivity, Chaim Perry and Amiram Cooper and Yoram Metzger, to know that they've been murdered there and didn't come back here when it was possible to bring them back. And she will go out and she will protest, and she will stand for the release of the hostages until the last one will be home. That she promised me.
We've been talking here in studio about heroes in the country, the residents of the kibbutzim, and Yocheved, your grandmother, we all know, actually met Yahya Sinwar during her time in captivity and courageously asked him if he wasn't ashamed to do such a thing to people who for years support peace. And we know he didn't answer. Your grandparents are pillars of the community, peace-loving people. It just speaks to the evil of Hamas. And to that point, when you hear that there may be some level of cautious optimism around progress to get to a deal, how does that make you feel? What are your thoughts?
So first of all, you spoke about those heroes, and you just spoke, I heard you about those soldiers that have been heroes in Kibbutz Be'eri, together with the guard of the kibbutz. So in Nir Oz, the IDF never arrived, and the heroes were the inhabitants of Kibbutz Nir Oz, those guards, including Tamir Adar and Aviv Atzili, who fought there, and all these kibbutz, because eventually on October 7, they defended the country. They defended the country from the terrorists to get to Beersheba and to get to Tel Aviv and to get to and other places. My grandfather, who built this kibbutz in 57, to defend the country and expand the country to those borders. And now, after 84 years, in his age of 84, he again defended the country by even being kidnapped and fought against them. And I think that we should really thank them. Everyone in the country should really thank them and come and say a lot of thanks and sorry for what happened from the government and everyone. And now when you spoke about the deal, you know, we have to remember the goal of the war is to release the hostages. And the hostages can be an excuse for continuing the war. So now we have the situation and the opportunity to release the hostages, to release the only great-grandfather held hostage in the world, which is my grandfather, and to release those women, like my sister, Arbelia, which is like a sister for me, after 9 months that we know what can happen to those women there. And from what I hear, there is a progress in the negotiations. Some of the sections been solved, and I really hope that we can see everyone home very soon and have a total deal that will bring everyone back home. I feel that there is one thing that I want to discuss with you about. There are 3 solutions for the day in Gaza. The first solution for those who replace the IDF can stay, Israel can stay, which that's bad. Hamas can stay there, which that's awful. And the third solution is kind of an international force, what we heard today from the Washington Post that was discussed in the negotiations. And to understand, you know, that if the world is taking so much care about the Israeli, about the Palestinians, about Gaza, take control. And I want to ask you, do you think Israel or Hamas can be there, or another solution is the solution that has to be there?
And as we heard from Israeli leaders, Daniel, moral and ethical duties to bring the hostages home, whatever it takes. Our hearts are with you, Daniel Lifshitz. We hope for good news about your grandfather, all the hostages, and our hearts are with your grandmother as well and all your family. We are hoping for good news as you are outlining. Thank you as always for speaking to us on The Rundown. Thank you.
Thank you.
Just heartbreaking beyond. Jonathan, your reaction to exactly that. You can hear the pain, the angst, waiting for some kind of word and knowing that these conflicting reports keep on happening around some kind of solution. What do you say to a family like that? All this time waiting for word.
Yeah, I actually met his family member Rita Lifshitz in Sweden. She was out campaigning, lobbying, trying to raise awareness in Sweden because she grew up there for the release of Israeli hostages, great-grandfather. It is extremely sad, but what I listen to and what I comment on is what he says the goal of the war is to release the hostages, and what the Israeli government says the goal of the war is to defeat Hamas and release the hostages. And I think that really crystallizes the difference here and the agony and the pain for the families of the hostages and the tremendous suffering that they're going through, where these two goals cannot, I think, be achieved in the way that is satisfactory to everybody at the same time. Something has to give, and up until now, what is giving are hostages and their families.
Unimaginable to think of what the families of the hostages are going through. Big decisions need to be made. Gentlemen, stay with us. We turn our attention up north. One person has been critically wounded in a Hezbollah drone attack in northern Israel. More in this report.
Hezbollah's leader committed to immediately stop striking Israel if a Gaza ceasefire agreement is reached. But in the absence of such a deal, the daily attacks on Israel's north continue. One person was critically wounded near Kibbutz Kabri, located 5 miles from the Lebanon border, by a Hezbollah explosive-laden drone. Additional damage was caused to some homes.
We were in the car about to start driving south. Suddenly, we heard the sirens, and in an unexplainable instinct, we left the car, ran inside the house. Then we heard a loud boom and felt a blast that blew the door open. The car was completely destroyed. It's a miracle that we even survived.
The IDF said several suicide drones launched from Lebanon impacted multiple areas in the western Galilee. Some were intercepted before crossing into Israeli territory. The military said it struck multiple Hezbollah sites overnight, including a launch site that targeted Israel. Locals in Lebanon reported Israeli airstrikes and artillery shelling in multiple villages on the border throughout Thursday.
Hezbollah says it is not only responding to the latest assassinations and strikes on its personnel, but is now retaliating to every single Israeli strike or shelling on southern Lebanon.
In a televised speech honoring a senior commander killed in an Israeli drone strike, Hezbollah's leader said they have managed to exhaust Israeli forces in the north and signaled he is seeking to end the fighting.
When the fighting stops in Gaza, we will stop fighting. If the Israelis want to continue in southern Lebanon and attack southern Lebanon, then we too, in a way or not, if we open a front to defend Gaza and the people of Gaza, in a way or not, then we will defend Lebanon, South Lebanon, our people, and our dignity.
Nasrallah's comments come days after Israeli Defense Minister Yoav Gallant declared that a ceasefire in Gaza does not mean a ceasefire with Lebanon, as international attempts to avoid a wider war in Lebanon continue.
We are striking Hezbollah very hard every day, and we will also reach a state of full readiness to take any action required in Lebanon, or to reach an arrangement from a position of strength. We prefer an arrangement, but if reality forces us, we will know how to fight.
Now for the latest on the ground, we go live to correspondent Zach Anders in northern Israel. Zach, what's happening there right now?
Yeah, still waiting for official confirmation as to the status of that man that was injured in today's attacks. It is a 30-year-old man. We don't know yet if this is a civilian or a soldier reservist that's stationed up here. We do know at this point in the night, Hezbollah claiming responsibility for 7 attacks. They've claimed today to have killed multiple soldiers. This is not reflected in any reality that we're seeing on the ground right now, and through our sources, we have not seen anything that indicates that there's been a major event outside of the one who is seriously, we're told, critically wounded by this earlier attack, just the one. We're still, again, waiting for status updates on that. But from the other attacks, we don't have any significant reports of damage, no other casualties reported at this point in the night. Hezbollah making an interesting admission. We've had to translate the Arabic a few times to be able to make sure that we're reading this right. In their latest statement, they admit that their safe houses are located in Ter Haifa and Yemen, these southern Lebanese villages that have been hit very hard today, by our understanding, by the IDF. Interesting for Hezbollah on their part to admit that they have located safe houses in these villages.
Certainly interesting development there indeed. Thank you so much for now, correspondent Zach Anders, live from northern Israel. More to come from Zach, of course, in the coming hours. Taking a short break, coming up on the rundown, the latest out of the United States. Stay tuned, back in a bit.
This broadcast is brought to you by Israel Bonds, the most direct and impactful way to support Israel. Invest now at israelbonds.com. This broadcast is brought to you by Israel Bonds, the most direct and impactful way to support Israel. Invest now at israelbonds.com.
Welcome back to The Rundown. Our coverage continues. 3 U.S. lawmakers have requested that the Department of Justice investigate a pro-Palestinian publication with links to a Gazan journalist who held 3 Israeli hostages in his home in Gaza. Abdallah al-Jamal worked for the Palestine Chronicle. He was killed during that dramatic Israeli rescue operation last month that saw hostages Shlomi Ziv, Andrei Kozlov and Almog Meirjan brought back home after being held captive since the Hamas terror assault on the 7th of October. Correspondent Robert Swift has more in this report.
The heads of 3 U.S. committees have written to the Attorney General to urge an investigation into the Palestine Chronicle, a publication registered as a non-profit in the U.S. They accuse the organization of providing material support to Hamas and of associated financial crimes. Abdallah al-Jamal, a Palestinian journalist, is accused by the Israeli military of having held 3 Israelis hostage in his home. He was killed along with his wife and 74-year-old physician father by Israeli special forces during the rescue operation. Al-Jamal is described by Palestine Chronicle as a freelance contributor, though his title was changed from the original correspondent following his death, according to the Jewish Insider. Separately, one of the 3 hostages, Almog Meirjan, is suing the Chronicle for giving al-Jamal a platform to, quote, disseminate Hamas propaganda. Israelis were overjoyed by the rescue of the 3 men in June, along with Noah Argamani, located at a separate location. Between 100 and 274 Palestinians were killed during the Israeli operation in Nuseirat, including Hamas gunmen and civilians hit by Israeli airstrikes.
And now, for more insight, we welcome Anat Alon-Beck, professor at Case Western Reserve University School of Law, joining us now from Herzliya here in Israel. Anat, thank you so much for your time. An unprecedented situation. It was a shock to many, but not to everyone in this region when it emerged that Abdallah al-Jamal, who had held 3 Israeli hostages in his home, was a reporter. So talk us through this case against these publications affiliated with an American registered nonprofit.
Thank you so much for having me on your show today. It's really an honor. And it's such an important case to bring up the attention of what is going on in terms of the media companies, and unfortunately what we've seen here, and that is providing material support to terror and having a contributor, more than that, a reporter that worked for a media organization that throughout that time, while he was holding hostages in Gaza, he was reporting daily from Gaza. And when he was captured, that we had learned about his affiliation with Palestine Chronicle. And honestly, it is so sad and so important to bring up to the attention of the media what is going on around us.
It is beyond staggering when one thinks of the kinds of articles that he was writing at the time that he had 3 Israeli hostages holed up in his home. It really raises so many questions about exactly what a reporter is supposed to be. Tell us more about the case Almog Meyajan, one of the rescued hostages who was held in that very home, filed a lawsuit against the Palestine Chronicle. I'm unfortunately going to have to stop you right now because we're going to hear right now from IDF spokesperson Daniel Hagari.
Sure.
On that day, the IDF had failed at its mission to protect and defend Israeli citizens. We did not prepare to the murderous terror attack of Hamas that included thousands of terrorists who penetrated into Israel in dozens of places and started a massacre and a killing and a spree of kidnapping. It is our responsibility and our duty to investigate what had happened and to learn where we had failed and what we must correct, and to draw the necessary lessons and implement them immediately in the defense methods and in our combat plans. The responsibility and duty, that is what led us a few months ago to start, during wartime, during combat, a series of operational investigations that their purpose was to investigate the events of October 7th and the events that led up to October 7th. As we had promised, we are going to present the findings over the next few months, and to do so modestly with transparency. The Israeli public deserves answers, and it is our responsibility to look first and foremost to the people living in these communities and the bereaved families, to look them in the eyes and answer the most difficult questions. Today, we presented the investigative report of the battle in Be'eri. We presented the findings to the residents of Kibbutz Be'eri who have been evacuated from their homes for 9 months now and who live in the Dead Sea, and the bereaved families. I know that some of you are asking, how come we're presenting this investigation first? Let me explain. We are in the midst of a wide-scale investigative process that thoroughly looks into the IDF's operational and intel perceptions, the conduct of the Supreme Commanders on October 7th. We present the investigations based on their preparedness. We try to finish them as quickly as possible in order to provide answers to the residents, to the bereaved families, and the families of the hostages who want to know what happened on that day, and also in order to adapt our combat and our defensive methods immediately. This investigative report, this debriefing, is not the end of the process. It's just the beginning. Kibbutz Be'eri is a house to one of the largest communities in the area of the Western Negev. The kibbutz lost 101 of its members. 35 of kibbutz members had been abducted, and 2 additional hostages who hid there while fleeing from the Nova Music Festival. Out of them, 11 are still being held in Gaza. The kibbutz was attacked by dozens of terrorists from several places of penetration, and by noontime on October 7th, there were about 340 terrorists. In fighting that lasted 3 days, our forces overpowered the terrorists, but it took a very heavy toll. 31 members of the Rapid Response Squad, IDF soldiers, police officers, and members of the security forces were killed in that battle. Our forces fought heroically while displaying utmost courage. Every unit that participated in the battle lost a fighter or a commander. Alongside these acts of courage and heroism, there were some grave mistakes that were examined in the investigation, and we are going to learn from them. And we're also going to present them this evening. The Be'eri debriefing was led by Major General in Reserves Miki Edelstein. Miki and the members of the committee sat with the members of the Rapid Response Squad for hours, with members of the kibbutz, the commanders who were active there, and members of the security forces. Also, thousands of items of evidence were collected about the fighting that went on in the area of the kibbutz, and the conclusions are clear-cut. October 7th is one of the most difficult and darkest days that the State of Israel has known since its establishment. The IDF failed at its mission to protect and defend the people of Kibbutz Be'eri. It pains me to say that the IDF should have defended the members of Kibbutz Be'eri, but regretfully, we were not there for many hours of fighting. And for hours, the people of Be'eri protected their families with their own bodies as they faced the terrorists on their own. Their heroism and the exceptional heroism and resourcefulness of the members of the kibbutz is what stabilized the defense lines in the first hours of combat, while blocking the attackers, the terrorists, from spreading on to the rest of the kibbutz. Alongside the rapid response squad, there was also the emergency community squad who guided the forces and assisted the residents. After examining the findings, the investigative team presented a series of conclusions. Today, I'm going to briefly present the main conclusions of the team. The full findings were published this evening on the IDF website and are available to each and every Israeli directly and without any mediation. And what comes out of these conclusions, in the first 7 hours of fighting, the members of Be'eri had to fight the enemy almost exclusively on their own. Many mistakes of the IDF forces stemmed from a lack of understanding of the magnitude of the event and the deployment of forces that was decided on with respect to a scenario that was not in line of what had actually happened. And the scope of the forces that came there, we discovered, which included about 700 IDF and security forces fighters until early afternoon. The fighting there had no command and control, and there was no coordination between the different units, and that caused several events in which security forces gathered at the entrance to the kibbutz but did not immediately go into action. This disorder characterized many areas of fighting during October 7th, and it is currently being debriefed as part of the general debrief, which will also be presented to the Israelis in the future. I'd like to talk about the hostage event at the house of Pessi Cohen of blessed memory. This event took a significant importance in Israeli media. Dozens of terrorists locked themselves in the house with hostages in the heart of a combat zone. We never had to contend with an event similar to it in the past, and the hostages were held by ruthless terrorists who had planned to kidnap them to Gaza. And when they failed to do so, they deliberated whether to kill the hostages and commit suicide. The debrief committee, the investigative committee, determined that in view of the difficult circumstances there, the squad team, the Shin Bet, and the IDF had all operated professionally and reach professional and responsible decisions. They thoroughly exhausted the efforts to negotiate with the kidnappers, and only once things escalated and once they've exhausted all the attempts, the negotiating attempts to rescue civilians, then it was decided together to use tank shelling in order to exert pressure on the terrorists. The decision to try and rescue under fire was reached after all efforts to negotiate the rescue of the hostages failed to bring any fruit. And then there was a series of gunshots from within the house, and that made them suspect that they were murdering hostages. There was a thorough investigation with the police and the ISA and the squad team, in which we presented to the family members our assessment regarding the circumstances of the death of these hostages. The team determined that from the information examined so far and upon our estimate, the people inside the building were not harmed by the tank shells. The team decided that most of the hostages who were found in the house were murdered by the terrorists. In addition, there was one incident in which hostages who were outside the building were impacted by shrapnel from the tank shell, and it is highly likely that one of them was killed by the shrapnel. The family members asked some very difficult questions and brought up other cases in which we will have to investigate, and we shall investigate together with the families until we understand all of the circumstances. As for the functioning of the senior commanders who were at the place, the investigative committee found that they operated in collaboration and in coordination and professionally under very difficult circumstances and did everything possible in order to save the civilians. And regretfully, that incident ended with some very difficult outcomes. And these are some of the conclusions. Every citizen who wishes to read the findings can do so on the website. It is important to emphasize that this is an evolving debriefing. That means that every new piece of information that will be added will be examined and checked. It is clear to us that there are answers we will have to complete along the way, and we shall be there in order to provide a response. At this point, the IDF is implementing the lessons that come out of the debrief, and the findings of the debrief remind us of the utmost and clear command that every soldier in the IDF must protect and defend civilians. That is a top priority, to strive to engage and to serve as a buffer between civilians and terrorists. We must once again instill this value in the best possible manner among all IDF soldiers. It is important to once again say that there was heroism of commanders and soldiers and police officers in face-to-face fights and battles with the terrorists, and they sacrificed their lives in order to save the members of the kibbutz. We will publish all of the investigations and debrief transparently, and of course while adhering to information security wherever necessary. This is only one debrief out of many, but it is the beginning of a long and important process of correction and the building of trust again between the IDF and the Israelis. At the end of the debrief processes that will make it possible to come up with a full picture, in addition to the operational conclusions that will be implemented immediately, other conclusions will be drawn as well. The most important thing for us is the public trust, reaching the truth, and the duty to establish better protection, better defense, which all Israelis deserve. Even at this point in time, the IDF is in the middle of a complex multi-arena war in the north, in Gaza, in Judea and Samaria, in the land, in the air, and in the sea. The debriefs and the investigations and finding out the truth, this is a key value of the IDF in order to avoid past problems and to fight in the best possible way, both in the present and in the future. Questions? Sir, you talked about Pesi's house.
IDF spokesperson Daniel Hagari outlining there the findings over that investigation into the battle at Kibbutz Be'eri, something we were talking about earlier on in the show, and saying the importance right now of lessons being learnt and building trust again. And right now, I want to go back to the discussion we were having earlier on with Anat Alon-Beck. Thank you very much for staying to continue this discussion. When we spoke earlier, we were talking about one of the rescued hostages, Almog Meojan. He was, of course, held in that home of Abdallah al-Jamal, a civilian, a journalist, and now is filing a lawsuit against the Palestine Chronicle, accusing that publication and its leadership of providing material support for terrorism. So tell us about the likelihood of success in that case. Tell us more.
This is such an important case, honestly, because think about the fact that we have an Israeli citizen, right, Almog, who was kidnapped. He was held hostage for 246 days. And during that time, he was held hostage at the house of al-Jamal. Al-Jamal was a Hamas operative and a spokesperson for Hamas. And he was rescued. Almog was rescued in a daring mission by the Israeli Defense Forces, by the IDF. And his capture, as I said, he was not just a Hamas operative or a spokesman. He was a journalist. He was a journalist for the defendant in the case, which is the People Media Project, Palestine Chronicle. which is a US-based tax-exempt news organization. This is a big deal, okay? And that's why it's reaching the news around the world. And it was under the leadership of the defendants, Ramzi Baroud and John Harvey, that Palestine Chronicle employed a Hamas operative. And he offered him, right, think about it, a platform in the United States to write and disseminate Hamas propaganda. And he was disseminating Hamas propaganda during that time. And think about the craziness. This was subsidized, right, through a tax-exempt charitable organization by U.S. taxpayers. And again, I think this is so important.
Right.
It's an important case. And we hope that it's going to succeed, and we're going to know very soon. We really hope so. And I do know that there has been some criminal investigations underway, and Congress is looking into this as well. And I wanted to thank the Congress people that are starting the investigation. Thank you so much for doing this. I think it's important.
Professor Anat Alon-Beck, we certainly will be following all these developments. And of course, it raises questions about what this means for other so-called journalists and other people inside Gaza who were holding people hostage, who were abducting civilians out of Israel. We will be watching with keen interest. Thank you very much for speaking to us here on The Rundown.
Thank you so much.
Now, fresh doubts have emerged about President Joe Biden's re-election chances as more prominent Democrats voice concern over his disastrous debate performance against former President Donald Trump last month, calling on the 81-year-old leader to quit the race. For more, we go live to senior U.S. correspondent Mike Wagenheim. He joins us from New York, and the president is under much pressure, including from within his party, Mike, even from the celebrity world. He has a major press conference later. Tell us what's at stake.
His presidency, the Democratic Party's ability to govern in the House of Representatives and the Senate, the future of the United States. What should I carry on? So much is at stake right now, and Biden's legacy is at stake right now as well. So much to be determined over, I think, these next few days. It seems that while the NATO summit was going on and world leaders were in Washington, many Democrats have been reticent to voice their opinions and voice their particular positions. It's tough to put the leader of your party, the president of the United States, in a bad light when foreign leaders are on your own soil. And I think once the summit closes down today and as leaders start taking off to their respective capitals, that we're going to start to hear more come out and more representatives in the Democratic Party, leaders, donors, take a position and make their voices known. Benny, if you ever had a leaky roof, you feel a couple drops coming through. Okay, I'll put a bucket under it, but it can wait till tomorrow. But it gets worse and worse. It doesn't get any better. The drips don't stop. All you have is a crack in the roof that just keeps opening up. That's what's happening right now with the Democratic Party. One way or another, they've got to fix the roof here. I think Biden is kind of set in his position right now. He only listens to a few people, but when you have a backbencher saying something, it's much different than a Chuck Schumer or Nancy Pelosi saying something. People who've been around the president for quite some time now and hold some weight in the party. Major donors start saying something, it holds more weight. I think we're going to hear more from those voices. It seems like the Hakeem Jeffries and the Chuck Schumers of the world, the leaders of the Democratic Party in the House and Senate respectively, have been opening up their ears. We want to get everybody's opinion before, we reach consensus on something. That's all well and good, but the time is ticking away here in the nomination process. I think we're going to start to hear more from those leaders here, probably early next week, kind of with a unified position one way or another.
And of course, when that press conference happens, every gesture, any hesitation, any confusion will be scrutinized as he takes questions there from the media. Thank you so much. As always, live from New York, senior U.S. correspondent Mike Wagenheim. Meanwhile, reports that the U.S. intends to soon send bunker-busting bombs to Israel weighing 440 pounds, now that it had earlier withheld from arms shipments. That's according to the Wall Street Journal. Jonathan Conricus, the significance if this is in fact the case, if these arms, in fact, these Buster bombs do in fact get here?
If it's true, then it's good news. There are still, I think, items on the list of bombs and equipment, weapons that Israel has requested, and they are still not being delivered. But if this is true, this is good news. It's good news for Israel. It is good news vis-a-vis Iran, and it's good news vis-a-vis Hezbollah. I think it's also good for Americans standing in the world, Israel or the US standing up to Israel. Israel is in dire need of support, and now is the time to show that support. So I welcome that. I hope it's true, and I hope that we will see additional coming closer between Washington and Jerusalem, less public debate and daylight between the two sides, and a more unified front, because there definitely are so many threats in the region, all of them originating from and being funded by Iran, the Islamic Republic of Iran. And I think that only a unity between US and Israel can have a chance of really changing the security situation in the Middle East, and any division, especially public ones, will do good for Iran, bad for Israel, and bad for the US.
And Ariel, very briefly, your thoughts on the role that Iran is playing right now. We keep on hearing out of Hezbollah, if things go quiet in Gaza, things will go quiet up north. Your take, very briefly.
Hezbollah isn't the only Iranian proxy that's saying that. The leader of the Houthis, Abdul Malik al-Houthi, said the same thing today, that if Hamas reaches a ceasefire in Gaza with Israel, then they will adhere to that too. This appears to be an axis-wide position, because we know that in recent weeks, the Iranian officials, IRGC commanders, have been deliberating, trying to bring what will be the Iranian position in the face of a ceasefire in Gaza. Obviously, this is a position that they want to sell to the world. The question is, does that ensure Israel's safety? I'm not so sure about that.
It certainly is the main question, security across the region. Middle East correspondent Ariel Osaran, Lieutenant Colonel in the Reserves Jonathan Conricus, thank you both so much for being here on The Rundown. I'm Vanessa Levine. Thank you for watching.